All right. Well, welcome. Greg Clark is joining us from the physics department at Manchester University. You mind introducing yourself? Or
No, not at all. I'm Greg Clark. I've been teaching at Manchester since 1992, so I've been around a little while. And I teach, in the physics department. I don't know what else you would like to hear about me, but I have an interest in the kinds of questions that you've been asking. Over the last, 10 years or so, I've helped put together and continue a faculty and staff discussion on questions related to science and religion once a month during the semester. And that's been really fulfilling. And some of these questions are some that we've talked about in that group in the past.
thanks. And Christopher Watson?
Christopher Watson. I teach at the Perdue Fort Wayne Department of Physics, although I met Justin and Greg while I was at Manchester for several years. I've always had an interest in various interpretations of quantum mechanics in physics, and both as I taught quantum mechanics, but also just as a side hobby interest as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thanks for joining us.
It might be worth just pointing out, I mean, just in terms of background, Christopher's an astronomer, and so is more steeped in sort of cosmology sorts of things than I would be. I'm a surface scientist, so I deal with materials. My interest is more in passing rather than related to the areas that I've studied.
Yeah, I mean, although like it's easy to overemphasize the cosmology aspect. I mean, I have taken classes in cosmology and the specific astronomy related to that. But Justin and I have talked quite a bit about quantum mechanics stuff, and that is pretty distantly related to cosmology. I mean, the hardcore details are so separated that like having studied one isn't much of a help for studying the other.
Yeah, kind of the two extremes of the spectrum, right?
Right. Yeah, it's the classic, right? It's the classic way to describe it is like it's both the smallest and the largest scale simultaneously.
Well, before we go there, I wanted to be in a room with the two of you talking about this stuff for a long time, and Christopher and I've had the experience to do that, and Greg as well, in different contexts. So let's get our question to start us off. And this was from a book that we read in our science and religion discussion group called "Why Does the World Exist?" by Jim Holt. So you don't have to answer that just yet, but rather
there's no quick answer.
Yeah, but maybe if you could talk about how you start to think of that question, not just within your discipline, just broadly.
Greg, you want to start?
Oh, sure, I suppose so. I did watch there's a video, a TED talk by Jim Holt, who authored that book, that I watched, maybe an hour or so ago, just to get these ideas back in my head. My head's been elsewhere for the last semester or so, but in the talk, he brings up some points of view of various philosophers, and most of them I don't agree with, and I don't think Jim Holt does either. But he talks about the universe, the question being one similar to the question, why does the universe exist? Is a similar question as to why do we exist, or why do I exist? And I can relate to that. He also talks about it in terms of a cosmic mystery, which is, I think, pretty appropriate in its way. The science of physics is all about, or just the sciences in general, is all about trying to find explanations, trying to find causes for events. I mean, essentially. And in terms of why the universe exists, you have to go back to the beginning of the universe, I suppose, to start trying to answer that question. And then you're left with, from what I know about our understanding the physics of the Big Bang, say, there's still a lot of mystery around that, right? I mean, when you take it back far enough, what's the cause? And I'm not, in some ways, I'm not sure that science can ultimately answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you kind of introduce that is really helpful. I mean, the way that I think of a lot of scientific progress is not just finding the explanations or the causes, but like the patterns in things that like a cause to be explainable and persuasive among us has to be a pattern that's, you know, reproducible and all those standard scientific descriptions. And one of the real challenges of analyzing the early universe is the fact that, like, in a very real sense, there's very little reproducible about certain aspects of that. And looking for patterns in one-time events is a challenge. It's not unique, but I mean, there are other one-time events, but this seems like, you know, one of the biggest.
Yeah, it's kind of the ultimate, right? The ultimate
Yeah.
one-time event, right?
Yeah. I think I've said this before, to both of you in various ways, but the way that I find helpful to think about like the very early universe and like the beginning of time is, I mean, there's always been a debate among cosmologists of various theories that either argue that the universe has always been around or that the universe had a definite beginning. And to that question, I think it's at least useful to recognize that there is an answer. The universe either started or it did not start, and always has been. One of those has to be true and the other one has to be false. We don't know if time started or if time always has been. But I mean, what we normally describe as the Big Bang is a description of how the universe was 13.8 billion years ago, and how the currently visible universe was smaller and more dense and more hot, and how it's expanded, how space has expanded over time. But if you go to very, very, very early times, our physics breaks down. Like, it's not good enough to describe it. And once the physics breaks down, the theoreticians can come up with all sorts of ideas that you can't prove wrong yet.
And they have.
Yeah, there are many, many ideas, some of which involve time starting and some of which involve time having continued before that time in a way that we just haven't been able to observe. So both are still consistent with what we observe and, you know, the current laws, how we understand the laws of physics. But I don't think that changes the fact that either time did start or time always has been. One of those, I think, has to be right.
Well, Christopher, then if we went with, say, the option that it didn't have a beginning or didn't have a cause or didn't have a start in a time,
right?
What how would you have causation with like an infinite series? It seems that there's a lot of logical problems afoot, just in my mind, rationally.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Although, and I have no quick answer to that. So
it would have to be an infinite one, right?
Right. Although, I mean, I don't think that's impossible, right? Like, we're comfortable with other types of infinity. For example, you know, the countable numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, they go on forever. There's no end to them. There's an infinite number of them, in a sense. And that's not something that we find disturbing. And I personally suspect that the idea of time going backwards forever could be a similarly comfortable infinite. That, like, just as the idea of there being an infinite series or sets or infinite numbers and in time extending infinitely into the past could be perfectly consistent with everything that you've ever observed in your life. That it doesn't violate any laws, any principles. It's hard to imagine, but, like,
There are a lot
So
of
are
things that are
atoms.
hard to imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So are electrons.
I mean, honestly, so are dinosaurs, right? Like, there's lots of things that are like surprising. So are stars.
Yeah.
So,
Well, there's this idea, some physicists have talked about, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on cosmology. I don't know names per se, but of an oscillatory sort of situation, right? So the Big Bang was just one node and we're in an anti-node, right? In a sense of doing these oscillations in time of universes appearing, disappearing, appearing, disappearing. I mean, that's a possibility, right? In terms of an infinite time.
I have to admit that I struggle to understand and those are struggles for me. Although, like, the people that work on and make important contributions to like quantum mechanics that uses that sort of language seem very comfortable with those answers.
Mm-hmm.
And so my struggle I take as more my own struggle than weaknesses in those explanations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I feel the same way about in the video, that TED talk, Holt talks about this as well. But the idea of infinite number of parallel universes, it just seems to me kind of a cop out, right?
Yeah. I mean, the way that I usually describe, I mean, the parallel universes oftentimes gets tied into quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
And the way that I usually describe it when I teach quantum mechanics is that every presentation of quantum mechanics is crazy. Mm-hmm. Every single version is. And if there's a version that you think sounds reasonable, it's because the person has hidden the crazy someplace that you don't realize. But there is always crazy.
Uh-huh.
And this is the study of the micro level of physical reality.
Like atoms.
How atoms mechanics.
Mm-hmm. Like electrons and protons and the whole, like, how atoms interact with each other. But like, I mean, the standard description of a particle can like tunnel through a wall or be two places at once, or it's not really there until you look and observe that it's there, or when it can be in two places at once, the universe breaks up into two versions of the universe, one the particle in one spot, one in the particle in the other spot. There's many crazy things that sound ridiculous and like very sci-fi, but there's, I mean, two things to remember. One, the mathematics makes very, very, very precise predictions that match our observations in a way that nothing else does. And the mathematics there's always some crazy, any self-consistent description ends up making predictions that are very counterintuitive, like the universe breaking up into parallel universes or particles jumping across space, like, but only when you observe them.
And some of those are testable, but some of them aren't, right?
Right. Yes.
And so I tend to agree with Karl Popper and his sort of way of viewing science, that things really need to be testable.
Yes.
So that's why the whole parallel universe thing doesn't sit well with me.
Well, but that doesn't mean it's not true.
I agree, but it's just speculation unless you can test it.
Right. Yes. But it's
string theory would be another one. Quantum or string theory is a theory in quotes that tries to explain things that are even more fundamental than the quantum, sort of these so-called quantum fluctuations, I suppose is what Holt called them in the video. But it's actually even poorly named, right? It's named a theory, whereas it's not a theory at all, right? It's a hypothesis. We are nowhere near the technology we would need. We don't have the technology to be able to test the predictions of, say, the string theory. So it's really string hypothesis.
Well,
anyway.
No. So before we go into this, the parallel universes that relate, I wanted to return quickly before I miss it for Krister. You had talked about infinite series of numbers and being comfortable with that. And that reminds me of the infinite set of worlds. So that would mean there's an infinite number of me. Wow.
Could be.
And
I mean, that feels a little like concentrating on versions of you seems right. Like why do we care about specific people? I interrupted your question. Go ahead.
I think because I can only see the world from my perspective, so we have like three things. We have infinite set of numbers, infinite series of universes, but then the third thing that I also captured was that both of you in your own way are saying there are limits to the scientific method, and that's what makes it compelling, because it talks about what it can observe, but it doesn't mean that it has contained everything within that box, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people misunderstand that science has proven something within its domain of kind of rules, right? Like playing chess, you're not going to play checkers. And so before, I was wondering, Krister and Greg, if you think that this infinite set of numbers exists, or is it, so I have no problem with infinite set of numbers, because I don't think of it as the same thing as an infinite set of cups.
You mean like a cup exists, but 5 doesn't exist?
Right.
It's just a thought.
It's just,
well, if we want to go with Plato,
does any number exist? Yeah.
And I want to go with Plato. That's my temptation and inclination, is to go with the kind of sense that the pi 3.14 and so on, that ratio that exists in some way, and as to why different cultures discover it in their own way. So that's my inclination. So I'm curious if you think, both of you, whether like numbers exist to the same extent, as this. Because you said they exist in some sense, and I'm wondering what that sense is.
Yeah, no, I mean, okay, I don't know if Greg and I feel the same on this, but I'd say basically, yeah, like numbers exist. They're real. That numbers, I think of exist as like, this isn't, I don't know how common this is, but I think of it as, are they useful? Like you talk about the cup, like as it's a real thing because you can touch it, but like, that's the feeling that like the interaction between your skin and your brain and all that, and all of that's just useful. Like it helps you walk around in the world and operate. And things that are useful, we say they exist. Numbers are crazy useful. And so like, we may as well say they exist. And to the same extent that things that you can touch, it feels useful to talk about them as existing. It seems to me like it's that principle of being useful that I find the most convenient way to think of as existing. And in that sense, then, like, if you want to talk about parallel universes or whatever, like, if it's a useful thing to use, then sure, it exists. But if it's not useful, then it's a thought or a hypothesis.
Okay.
Well, what about God then? God, the idea of God's useful
to some people.
Therefore,
right?
God exists, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, so personally, I don't find it useful. So, I mean, it's not a way that I relate to other people or to how the universe behaves or, the world I see around me. Like, I don't find it as a way that, I find useful.
Yeah.
And so you would usually say that I don't think God exists.
So
although
existence becomes a person,
the usual.
Sorry, say it again.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like existence to some extent like is a personal thing. I mean, to the extent that like it's your judgment of what's useful. Although like, I mean,
we
can an
agree on
honest person disagree about how numbers are useful?
Yeah.
Like we all agree that some things are useful.
Yeah.
And no honest person could disagree with that.
Except if it's an overdraft fee.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Although I'm pretty sure that's not a majority opinion. I mean, I think most people prefer to think of existence in other ways.
Yeah, we're heading in. I mean, when you ask that question, do things exist? You're heading into philosophy more than physics, aren't you? I mean, if something in physics, you can test whether something exists in a sense that you can do experiments and you could try to observe, say, an electron. Right? And so we can observe electrons, the effects of electrons, so we say they exist. But then there's the, more philosophical way of looking at it is, well, we're so limited by our senses, and we live in this world that we can observe through our senses, but there's the separate reality, right, that exists, that we're part of, but we can only experience and can even conceive of a small part of that reality. And this is kind of Platonic, isn't it? It's doesn't that go back to Plato, Justin?
Yeah, formal realm, right? Where, and I think it's Roger Penrose, that famous physicist, mathematician, I should say more, that has these kind of three realms: this kind of physical world, the mental world, and then this Platonic world where there's the forms, the true, the beautiful, various shapes, and so on. And so that would be the idea, and that this world in some way is a copy, a shadow of that truer reality.
So where would numbers fit into that?
Way up at the top. But the one is even more. And the Greeks had I think a much better intuition of understanding. And this, so when I reflect on that book and our discussions in the past, the fact that the world is a mystery to me is still a fact that I have to take seriously. It is an impression, but the world makes no sense to me unless I go out to it. And I'm not a camera just receiving stuff, right? So there's intentionality. I have to have intention to contend with the world. And the world appears to me so transparent to reason that is just utterly mysterious. The world holds together, and from the little that I know about physics, if you get really down at the micro level, things are bouncing around, right? Like, and there's and nothing seems to be that stable, and yet here I am in this just rational kind of world. So I think that mystery is still evidence, not of something, but rather it needs to be attended to.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of I don't think any theologian would ever dare to come up with the many worlds hypothesis. So I mean, I'm with Greg there. I think that is, it's really funny, but that is like, wouldn't that be the mind of God then, if you exist in every infinite possible, way of being? I have to say it because I'm disturbed and delighted at the same time that this kind of, coldly rational system of science has come up with something that even the most fanciful theologian wouldn't propose.
Yeah, I mean, well, I want to go back. The other crazy ideas, like, if you don't like the idea of like there being parallel, many infinite universes, like there's other ways of describing quantum mechanics. And when I teach quantum mechanics, I do not spend more than 20 minutes of one day in talking about the many worlds. I spend the vast majority of the time talking about something else that is much more commonly described. However, it is in its own way just as crazy. And it has a view of the universe that depends on observing it that is, I mean, it incorporates randomness at a level that the more you think about it, the more disturbing it is. But it works. And it really challenges a person to wonder, like, what is observing the universe and what is there before I observe it? And what was there before there was anyone to observe it? And who are we? And I mean, none of those questions have obvious answers that the science like directs us towards. because we can't get out of ourselves. So it can come off as, I mean, it's just as disturbing, just in different ways.
Mhm.
Well, great. Do
You
you
start
think,
pushing.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I
Oh,
wanted
I
to
was just gonna say, you start pushing science to its limits when, you know, you start interpretation of some of the, especially more modern theories, is the scientists can't answer a lot of those questions, at least not now, right? And you know, technologies change, and we'll be able to maybe answer some more of the questions as time goes by. But ultimately there are going to be some like this one: why does the world exist? I don't know. Science isn't going to be able to answer that question, I don't think.
Well, the question then would be, do you think that the world is rational all the way down, right? I mean, is there a layer where you can say things happen for no reason?
No, you have to be really careful here. Like, I want to try to like probe this question, because there is, if there, I mean, there's a level of quantum mechanics where everything about the measurements leads us to believe that at some level an electron will randomly choose path A or path B. And when I say random, I mean there is no cause for it to choose one or the other. It is at the fundamental deep level a coin flip. There is nothing that, like, it's weird, but we have proven that there's nothing leading to the choice of A or B. It's not a lack of knowledge of the system. It fundamentally is unknowable. It is randomly choosing.
But there is
like, that is what's happening.
But there is a cause that forces the electron to make the choice, so to speak. Personifying.
Right. Yeah. So
there's
yeah.
causality still
within
there.
Right. But there's also a randomness fundamental to its behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just to be clear, so Greg, you're saying that there is a cause that makes that decision happen. Sorry to go anthropomorphic for this poor electron, but though I like thinking what it would be like to be an electron, you know, but so at some point there's a decision that there's something that has to happen that causes this random event.
At some level, although there are events that seem to be completely non-causal, like creation of exotic particles out of nothing, right? Can it, like an electron and a positron, a positively charged electron, just spontaneously appear, create, and then immediately annihilate with no apparent cause, and that's something that's been observed.
Except that wouldn't be, at least in philosophy and theology, that wouldn't be nothing, right? That would be
it's definitely something.
It's a something nothing. It's a field, right? But a field.
But the field is, in a sense, zero before. I mean, that's what Greg is describing. And that, I mean, if you want to say there's a cause of it, the cause is the nature of the universe just does this. Or you could say there's no cause, that there was nothing and then there was something. At some level, like, you're using words to describe the mathematics that everyone agrees on. But it sure seems, as Greg described, as like boom, boom.
Right. So that's an observation, and we have models that with which we're trying to explain that observation. Doesn't necessarily mean those models are complete, right?
But they work really, really well.
They do, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the end of physics is near. We haven't figured it out. We haven't figured it all out, and I don't think we probably will.
Yeah.
Well, at least not during this conversation.
Something I didn't finish saying before about this Greek intuition, because it relates to this where, you know, you each have wonder at the universe, and that's what makes you do what you do. And that they would, we think of the psyche, the kind of, which wouldn't be the mind in the way that we think of in psychology, but the whole person would be the psyche, the soul is the form of the person for, much of Greek thought, not all of it. But then there's something called the nous, N-O-U-S, and that would be kind of an intuitive faculty. So you wouldn't think of one or being as nothing. It wouldn't be something, but it would be something that you would participate in. You have to know oneness in order to understand it. And so I've just been so impressed by the fact that intuition, like what does it take for a mathematician or a physicist, right, to say, you know what, I know that this is true before I can prove it, right? Like mathematicians have the sense that this is true, and sometimes it's wrong, right? Because then, well, that
it's important, like
that dissertation,
Yeah.
but they still, what is it that knows? What is it that you both know, right? That you quest after? Like there's something else that drives you, and I'm just fascinated by that part of the human condition. Dare I say, spiritual condition.
Part of it's just the beauty of it all, right? Really, when it comes down to it. I mean, it's a beautiful, in terms of what we can observe, it's a beautiful place out here, right? I'm looking out my window. And I think trying to understand, make connections as to why some of the things I observe occur just adds to the beauty of it. Because there's not just a beauty in the observation, but there's a beauty in the mathematics we use to describe the observation.
Yeah, I'd second that. I'd agree that like there's a beauty that seems self-evident, not just on first examination, but all the way down.
Right. Yeah.
This is part of what Plato and the kind of perennial religious tradition from Advaita Vedanta to Buddhist traditions and Mahayana Theravada, classical theism and the Christian, and so on, that beauty is something that summons us. You both said that, and it struck me in the Jim Holt book when it finishes, and prior to our meeting together, we were lamenting that last chapter a little bit for different reasons, I'm sure, but that he essentially makes an aesthetic judgment, a judgment about, you look at the world, and I think it was really funny. He said, Brian Greene says this is an elegant universe, and he said it's not, and it's a mess. There's nothing impressive about it. If you do a calculation and in a computer, and it comes up after calculating a few millions, and it comes up with 3 sevens in a row and then 9 sevens in a row, you might think it's something really significant, but really just those numbers started to show up in the digits of pi or whatever. That's an aesthetic judgment, but it still calls for the explanation as to where the sense of the beautiful comes from. I mean, I used to think this stuff was just a sham, but now I'm thankful to know that I'm not alone, but like the sense of the beautiful is positive. It is summoning. And I think we don't need psychology for that. We need this kind of, that's recovering that sense of the nous, of intuiting the beautiful and responding to it.
It's a very human endeavor, appreciating beauty, as far as we know, right?
Except for the aliens that we're going to get reported on for the Senate. Doesn't that come like?
Oh God! Like, yeah. Except for them.
Animals. Do some animals appreciate beauty?
I have no idea.
I don't either. I've never been any other animal than human.
Yeah. I have to ask a pet lover.
I think I was talking with one of our colleagues about my reservation sometimes on kind of pop evolutionary psychology, and that looking at ancient myth would probably be a better way to think about how humans evolved, because they kind of record our cultural dreams together. And they have an answer for that transition. Gilgamesh does, from nature to culture, which is not lacking in its Freudian implications. But Gilgamesh is this great king, and they don't make a help partner, which is a female form, but they make Enkidu, who's this wild animal man. And they are, so that the helpmate is the one that kind of is someone that allows him to have competition and enjoy that. And they eventually become pretty clearly lovers. But the way that he becomes human, Enkidu, is he sends Shamhat, unfortunately, usually called a prostitute, but it's something far more, that she opens herself up to these different cosmic forces. I mean, temple prostitution is a whole different discussion for Hebrew Bible and things like that. But that it was at that moment, after they are together, I think for 7 nights, his eyes were opened and he knew he was naked. And it's before the garden story. But the sense that whatever you want to call that, the notion of desire, eros, and love are kind of caught up in that shift from what we think is natural to what is human.
And actually, in that book, Holt, we were talking a little bit about this before we started taping this, recording this is what I want to say. Is in the end that book Holt wrote on why do we exist? Why does the universe exist? He falls back to sort of flipping the question on its head. Why do things that exist stop existing? Why do some of the questions are like, why do we lose the people we love, or why do important parts of our world vanish? I mean, he turns it into a very sort of human question. But I'd be interested in knowing what you think about this comment I found. This was actually in Holt's book as well. I'm not sure if he mentioned it in the TED Talk. It's the philosopher named Adolf Grunbaum. Is that a name familiar to you at all? But he talks about the question of being this sort of misplaced astonishment at the universe's existence as sort of being the wrong question. And his answer is, go relax and enjoy yourself. Don't worry about why there's a world. It's an ill-conceived question. What do you think of that?
I think he's totally wrong. Yeah, I mean, to be not enchanted by this world would be to mistake and miss the most obvious thing in the world, which is that the world appears to be. Like that, the primordial fact is not about lines.
Being enchanted by the world and wondering as to the origins are pretty different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, to flip that on its head, during that TED Talk, he mentioned Schopenhauer, who apparently asked the question or made the statement of those who don't wonder about the contingency of existence are mentally deficient. So two opposite poles there.
Well, in psychoanalytic terms, in the French tradition, that we should be thankful that something is missing. And that would be, perhaps that's what he's getting to. I resonate with that. Because the explanation is lacking, I continue to seek after it. There's this famous, this French psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan, who talks about that which never stops not being written. It's just on the cusp. It's not present. As you said, I think, Greg, a number of times, because we're in the universe, we can't know it because we're in it, right? I can't get outside of myself and stand on my shoulders and then look at myself seeing. And there's that way in which there's always this constitutive, there's always this inherent gap between what we can, what we know as consciousness and what is being. And they can think of them as a Mobius strip as opposed to a dualism, right? Where that you're walking on one side of a tape and then all of a sudden you end up on the other side. So there's no clear distinction between where consciousness and being is, but you just can't know one. You can't know them simultaneously. I can't be my brain, because the moment I am, that wouldn't be me. With just a brain, your brain.
But that longing you talk about, Justin, the longing to understand, that's what science is all about.
I don't know if I've ever seen that in a science textbook.
Well,
The mystery of being. No, yeah, you're right.
I
It's all
mean,
about the mystery, right? I mean, if there's no, what's science got to do if there's nothing left for science if there's no mystery, in a sense, right?
right. Well, mystery and finding answers,
Yeah, right.
right? Like small
Exactly.
answers, but answers.
In that sense that the answer is always, there's always, I mean, we believe that the world is explicable. It's explainable, even if we're entertaining the idea that it's not. We can't function that way. We function as if it has an explanation and we seek it. And I think we take pleasure in that the final explanation would never be satisfying. I want the world to be explicable, explainable, but I never want to be able to get there.
If you know the answer to the ultimate question, it'll be disappointing, right?
I mean, it's a bit of an
I mean,
academic question since none of us have it, but like, I think I'd
Oh,
be
yeah.
satisfied with it. I'd be okay with that.
It reminds me of this book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, where they spend all this time trying to find the answer to the ultimate question, and they find out the answer, and it's 42. And then they have to, and actually the planet Earth was a big giant computer that was intended to actually find that answer. But then they have come back to, okay, so then what is the ultimate question?
What a wonderful observation. Yes, 42.
You will find ways to make sure something is missing.
Yeah.
So that we can seek out. Well, I mean, that's Greg, you know, I at the end of that book, I thought, and I forgot because I hadn't read it for a while. I know what he's written and how he's reflected on it, but why did he write it? And we don't know that, but whether it's pain or something that, you know, something that he is still wanting to have satisfied. I don't trust the ethical or the aesthetic judgment at the end. I know that that's what he's saying he believes, but there's something else that might be missing. And that's what kind of theological, philosophical world can get to. Each of you are in different ways. Well, should we have a final wrap up here now that we've solved the question?
Sounds good.
You know, the question I really wanted to ask, but I won't because we can maybe do another time, but what would it be like to sit on top of an electron, or sorry, a photon? I always wanted to know what that would be like.
I think Einstein thought a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was a useful, it was a useful thing for him to think about.
Good. I didn't get you to catch.
No, we're wrapping up, not starting.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, well, just a final reflection on this conversation and I don't know what it means in your careers as scientists and as fathers. Yeah. Question.
Well, I mean, it's always a set of interesting questions, and of course, interesting to talk to the two of you about, I mean, the nature of what we find interesting, what we find attracted to, what we find satisfactory in terms of explanations or goals, or just kind of when we look out the window, so to speak, and want to know the answers to things. What do we want to know the answer to, and what do we find a satisfactory answer to those questions? But you know, we come at things from different perspectives, and we find different things satisfactory. I mean, that's, I think, something that's always important to be reminded of.
And
Greg?
for me, we talked about infinity earlier and being comfortable with that idea. And I'm comfortable with this sort of great cosmic mystery about why does the universe exist? Why do we exist? Just fun to learn more about it, right? About the existence itself and ourselves.
Well, thank you both. It was really fun to talk to you and hopefully to do it again because I have more questions.
Well, thanks for inviting us, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah. All right. Well, until the next time we're all together, because we'll figure it out sometime. It's great to see you. And all right, take care.
All right. Take
Thanks.
care.